The first question that I want to ask you is about the politics of the Ramayana. The Ramayana, out of all the Hindu texts, Ramayana is one you work with the most. Your book on Hanuman, right? So I want to ask you about the politics of the Ramayana, the politics of the Bajrang Dal, and what you found out. Were there any startling discoveries in that area when you went about working for your book?
And you want me to speak specifically about the Hanuman book, Hanuman's Tale,
Hanuman
not
book
about my earlier book?
Your earlier book,
okay.
and right.
So let me start with the earlier book.
Right.
My first book is called The Life of a Text.
Right.
And it was published in India, but long ago, and went out of print.
Right.
And it's a study of the popularity of the Tulsidas Ramcharitmanas, the Ramcharitmanas.
Right. Ramcharitmanas.
How it became the very powerful and preeminent text that it is today.
Right.
And so it's a kind of a biography of the book.
Right.
That's why I called it The Life of a Text. I've sometimes said in Hindi, Granth Ka Jivan Charitra.
Right.
And it's a 400-year study. It includes historical dimensions, socio-political dimensions, a lot on cultural performance, things like Ram Leela, Ramayan Katha. The last chapter is called The Text in a Changing Society.
Right.
I basically draw a contrast between what I would call basically a Gandhian interpretation of Ramraj, which is a kind of liberation theology, albeit somewhat vague. But Gandhi's idea, particularly in his Hindi language discourse, that Ramraj represented Loktantra, democracy, grassroots, uplift, social activism. There's a quote from Gandhiji that I use where he says, Ramraj is rule of the people. Right. A person like Rama would never wish to rule. Right. And that was his so to say bhav, his feeling about the Ramayana. So the Ramayana can be worked by both camps and has been. Right. So that's a very interesting thing about the Ramayana tradition as a whole.
When you're saying worked by both camps, could you elaborate on that a bit?
For example, Swami, I believe his name was Swami Sahajananda. I may be getting his name wrong. There was a grassroots peasant revolt leader in Bihar in the 1920s who was a Ramanandi sadhu and a leftist, absolute leftist. And he used the manas all the time in his discourses. I mean, that was his medium of thought and expression. He was always quoting Tulsidas. But he had very radical political ideas. And then on the other hand, you have very orthodox, industrial strength Brahmin interpretation of the text where, that highlights other passages, of course. So my second book is about Hanuman. It's called Hanuman's Tale, T-A-L-E. The Messages of a Divine Monkey is the subtitle. So one of the arguments running through the book is that Hanuman historically has very often been associated with lower class and lower caste communities. And he has been a deity who has been sort of the people, of the larger mass of the people, and not an elite deity. There are no major temples to Hanuman that date back more than 300 or 400 years. No large temples, no royally patronized temples, no significant complexes. And even his iconography, except in friezes that depict Ramayana stories that you start finding from the Gupta period on, but freestanding images of just Hanuman alone, such as we are all familiar with today, they really don't start till around 11th, 12th century, and even then just a few. And it really is after that. So I look at that development, and the reigning explanation for this that you find in Hindi language scholarship and a very little bit of English language scholarship, because actually very little was written about Hanuman. But one explanation that I found repeatedly is that, it's all because of the Muslims. the coming of the Muslims and the oppression of the Hindus, and Hanuman is a protector deity, and therefore the Hindus rallied around Hanuman as their protector. This is a kind of, I call it a master narrative, that, because it occurs in quite a number of places. And many people will repeat that to you as a kind of obvious fact. And you know, scholars always like to look at obvious facts and say, well, you know, what if we looked from a slightly different angle? What if this wasn't quite so obvious? So what I do in my historical chapter is I look at 3 important historical moments where there's an obvious proliferation of Hanuman iconography and texts and worship. 3 particular historical periods. One is the Vijayanagar Empire. One is the Maratha, early Maratha period. And one is the Ramanandi sadhus in the 17th and 18th century. And in each case, I look at alternative explanations, and I find, in fact, very little evidence that it had anything at all to do
with the advent
with Muslims or Islam or a threatening other culture. But it had a lot to do with lower caste groups, what we would today call lower caste groups, peasant caste groups, coming into access to new kinds of self-expression and power, and starting to do more visible patronage, religious patronage. The evidence is very striking for Vijayanagar, particularly.
Could you narrate one of those real-life experiences? I'm asking you again because a lot of our viewers would not be able to read your book. But could you narrate one of those real-life experiences? It should be more interesting than the tales which we read about the stories we read about Hanuman.
This is a story that many of the stories in my book come from Hindi language. You know, inexpensive books that you buy in the bazaar. Hanuman Jeevan Charitra, Hanuman Leela, Hanuman Leelamrita, things like that, and 2 novels, 2 autobiographical novels in Hindi in which Hanuman narrates his own life story, which I find very fascinating. Atmakathas. So, but those, of course, some of your viewers or listeners might have access to. But I'll narrate a story that absolutely nobody knows, because it's about a Gora, it's about a Videshi. This is a gentleman who I met in the United States, who was living for a long time in Vrindavan, because he was a devotee of a particular guru there, and he was also a devotee of Hanuman. And it so happens that one day in the 1980s, he had gone across the Yamuna to have darshan of some sant at some ashram there. And with him were 2 young American women who were also, you know, bhaktas. They were Hare Krishna people or something. And they ended up staying a little bit too late at this ashram, and it became dark. And they had to go back across the Yamuna. And they got to the bridge, and there was somebody there who said, you know, there are dakus in the area, Thora Khatarnak hai, you know, you shouldn't go. But they really wanted to get back to Vrindavan. They didn't have any place to stay. So they started out across the bridge, and it was a moonlit night, but you know, still dark. And as they were partway across the bridge, they saw this this band of young men coming towards them who didn't look too good. Yeah, it looked like there could be trouble. And in fact, at a certain point, these young men started running towards them, making threatening gestures and sounds. And this gentleman, who I think was about 35, 40 at the time.
Around about how far back was this? How many
80s.
80s,
Yeah, I don't...
around about the 80s, Sorry, this gentleman.
He said, without really knowing what he was doing or why, he raised his arms and he shouted, Bajranga Bali ki jai, and he started running towards these men. And he really said, sort of lost all awareness of myself.
Right.
But I felt as if I was very, very big.
Right.
And as he ran towards these men, they turned around and they
Right.
fled.
Right.
And they fled so fast that several of them lost their shoes.
Right.
They were later found on the bridge.
That's a pretty crazy story.
And then, no, but it gets even better.
Right.
The next morning, he heard from some Babas
Right.
who had seen this from the riverbank
Right.
that they saw Hanuman
Oh.
chasing
these
these
guys.
gundas
Right.
across the bridge.
Right.
Yeah.
That's pretty insane.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's a
Right.
close encounter
Right.
of the
Right.
third
Right.
kind, or
Right.
fourth
Right.
kind, perhaps.
Right. Right.